this is Annie, and I am presenting, my presentation about the biography of George Harrison by yours truly. So, this is the introduction, a little bit about why I made this project, this presentation, about George, and just kind of some background. I think, George may have passed away in 2001, but his heart is very much alive in millions of hearts through his beautiful music that will continue to flow within him and without him. But he will continue to touch many hearts like my own for many generations to come. And here are the links to Here Comes the Sun and Within You Without You. A lot of links in this, so get ready. And there's a picture of some pictures and stuff. So yeah. I was so young when I was born. It's a reference to Cracker Box Palace, as I put the link there. It's a song of his. I recommend you listen to it if you haven't. George Harrison was born on February 25th, 1943 in Liverpool, England. He was the youngest of 4 siblings of his parents, Harold and Louise Harrison. George met the famous Paul McCartney in 1954 when Paul was 12 and George was 11. They went to school together. When George was 14, he got his first guitar, and he taught himself a few chords, which George getting a guitar would be something that would be important throughout his life, and career as a musician, because he was a guitarist. So that kind of paved the way. And those are pictures of him as a kid. With the Beatles. So this is a slide about the Beatles. And With the Beatles is also the album title of the second album of the Beatles, so it kind of goes together. See what I did there? Needless to say, the Beatles were and still are important to music today. I'm just realizing that rhymes. Wow. Hey, there you go. George Harrison joined the Beatles, then known as the Quarrymen, on February 6, 1958 at the age of 14, after being persuaded by Paul McCartney when invited to a Quarrymen performance. The famous John Lennon, who formed the Beatles and known as Quarrymen, he wasn't sure since George is younger if he should join the band. However, after getting to know George a little more, he decided to let him join the band. And folks, as they say, the rest is history. George is always known as the Quiet Beatle, but his impact in the Beatles sure wasn't small, nor quiet. He wrote many songs, hits really, such as Don't Bother Me or Here Comes the Sun, just to name a few, which many enjoy today, especially me actually. As the lead guitarist of the band, George was a staple member of the Fab Four. Fab he was. George made a huge impact on music forever with the reaping strings of his guitar. If you understand this little reference to All My Guitar Gently Weeps, one of my favorites. And he would continue to impact music in his years as a solo artist for many years to come. George's solo music career. See how I'm linking all these? After the infamous breakup of the Beatles, George started his own music career. In 1970, with the release of All Things Must Pass, which is actually my favorite album, one of my favorite albums of all time, actually, and is one of the most iconic albums of all time. If you ask me, it's just a beautiful thing, and that's a fact, not an opinion. Well, okay, it's an opinion, but still. With hits on the album like My Sweet Lord, What Is Life, among many others, George was not so quiet anymore. As the years went by, George would go on to release more iconic hits such as Got My Mind Set on You, which is actually a cover of one of his favorite tunes from the 50s, which many people don't know it's a cover actually, so that's a cool fun fact for you. Give Me Love, Peace on Earth, and other timeless tunes are enjoyed by people, especially people such as me, all over the world to this day. George released 12 studio albums in his solo career. The Beatles in India. In 1968, the Beatles ventured out on a vacation to India. This vacation would go on to have a huge impact on them, not only on their personal lives, but on music itself. As Paul Oliver, who's a biographer, he wrote a biography about George Harrison, he said, "The relationship between the Beatles and the Maharishi brought about an enormous interest in the West in Indian clothing, meditation, yoga, and the playing of the sitar," which the sitar will be talked about a lot in this because it was very important to George and it's a big part, played a big part in all this. The Beatles were already influential and popular in Western culture, that's for sure. Their experience in India, exploring different musical instruments such as the sitar, they would then go on to use in their music, bringing an unfamiliar sound, which is, Indian culture, into Western music, which then would change Western music forever. It's pretty cool. Spirituality. Many people refer to George as a quiet Beatle, but perhaps a better nickname would be the spiritual Beatle. George is a deep thinker and really a very spiritual man. After his trip in India, in India in 1968, George became very fascinated with Indian culture, especially Hinduism, the religion, and spirituality, so, the meaning of life as a whole. He began a friendship with Ravi Shankar, who was an Indian musician, and Ravi Shankar taught him to play an instrument called the sitar, as I talked about. The sitar is a stringed instrument that is found and heard, I guess it's really the same thing, talking about music, in Indian music. George would use this instrument in his music, bringing a new sound to popular Western music. Pretty cool, honestly. Spirituality was very important to George. This is often reflected in his music, with songs and the lyrics such as in his song My Sweet Lord, Awaiting on You All, The Inner Light, among many others. It was very important to him and had a huge impact on him and his art. Take a listen. So, since this is a presentation, I can't really click on these, but these are links to some songs. I recommend you listen to them. Coming up with a chord. When being interviewed for Guitar Weekly, when discussing I Want to Tell You off of the Beatles' Revolver, which I Want to Tell You is a hauntingly beautiful song is the way I would put it, and say, Harrison said, "I'm really pleased that you noticed that." They were talking about a chord. That's an E7 with an F on the top, played on the piano. I'm really proud of that because I literally invented that chord. The song was about the frustration we all feel about trying to communicate certain things with just words. I realized the chords I knew at the time just didn't capture that feeling. So after I got the guitar riff, I experimented until I came up with this dissonant chord that really echoed that sense of frustration. I think that's interesting that George said that because I like to write, and I find that I really express the thoughts I want to say in my, in my brain and heart onto paper that I find hard to say, just with words. I think art from the heart, if you will, to express your heart is a beautiful thing. I find that when you can really share truly how you feel about things, I guess. So I thought that was interesting. While my ukulele gently weeps. See what I did there? George was a big fan of the ukulele. He can actually even be heard strumming his cherished instrument at the end of the Beatles song, Free as a Bird. That song makes me emotional. It's a really touching song. I recommend you listen to it. I actually was inspired to play the ukulele because of George. It just seems like a really fun instrument, and, got it for Christmas last year. Still working on it. But, yeah. George actually collected ukuleles throughout his lifetime, and he would store a lot of them in his complex he bought in Hawaii, which is funny actually because my parents went to Hawaii on their honeymoon and after they got married, and they were on a volcano in Hawaii, and the tour guide actually said, "That's George Harrison's house." Like, they pointed, it was the end of the volcano, somewhere around the volcano. So, little did my parents know, there would be a big George fan in their lives a few years later. It's pretty cool. George, just like with all of George's music, well, I guess most of it, he brought a bunch of ukuleles and he would share them with his friends, including fellow musicians Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne of ELO, who are also in the supergroup The Traveling Wilburys, which brings us to our next point of discussion in this presentation. Time with the Traveling Wilburys. In the late 80s, along with fellow musicians Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison, Jeff Lynne of ELO, which stands for Electric Light Orchestra, is actually another one of my favorite bands. George formed a supergroup called the Traveling Wilburys, as we talked about. Together, the supergroup would release many iconic hits such as Handle with Care, End of the Line, among others. Heading for the Light and Maxine are some other ones I really love. And right there is a link to the documentary I already knew a lot of things actually about this, not to brag, but I've been a fan of George's for a long time. And the Traveling Wilburys, but this documentary is very cool, and I recommend you watch it. Put a link to it. Take a listen. Traveling Wilburys. There's just some songs I love. George's movie producing. What some may not know about George is not only was he a musician, an iconic one at that, very good, and an executive movie producer as well. He would produce iconic movies such as Monty Python's Life of Brian, which is a pretty good movie, funny, and Shanghai Surprise, among some others. George and Dennis O'Brien, who was his business partner in this film thing, he started a film company called Handmade Films. Those are some links and stuff about it. My favorite George Harrison song and album, All Things Must Pass. Look, there's two pictures of me wearing my George merch, if you will. One of my personal favorite songs of George's is All Things Must Pass. This song is important to me, one I particularly am very fond of in my heart because of the message of hope that is found and shared in the lyrics. Needless to say, 2020 and 2021 and 2022 have not been easy. They have been very hard on us and the world around us. I found myself pretty hopeless at times after losing 4 of my guinea pigs these past 3 years, who meant a lot to me, as well as my great uncle. I have felt very down, but when I hear All Things Must Pass, a feeling of hope enters me. With lyrics such as, "It's not always gonna be this gray. It's not always gonna be this gray." I feel in my heart that I will make it through things. With God's love, and George's music definitely helps, and I feel like he shared a lot of that love in his songs. Sorry for the background noise. Although it may seem dark at the moment, all things must pass. It will get better. Someday the light will drain the darkness. When there's light, The light always consumes the darkness. Love always wins. Light always wins, because love is light. Darkness only stains the nighttime. In the morning it will fade away. This is what makes this song so beautiful. Not only the beautiful guitar playing in the song, but the important message of hope that shines through it. And it's very relevant and especially needed in these times we're in with, COVID and all of that stuff. It's not always going to be this gray. Remember that. That's a link to the song. I recommend you listen to it. And the album's just a beautiful thing. Fun facts. George had an obsession with cars. In the music video for his song Faster, George is shown riding in the back of a race car. Pretty cool music video. George was friends with Emerson Fittipaldi. I don't know how to say his name exactly. But he was a famous race car driver, and he actually did a video for him. I think Emerson had gotten in a car crash, and he sang "Here Comes the Sun." Like, it was to the tune of "Here Comes the Sun." I think it was kind of sweet. Cool video I found. But the link to that is Faster. In the late 1960s, George became a vegetarian. Fun fact. George's favorite color was purple, which actually is mine too, so that was cool to learn. George loved a candy called Jelly Babies, which were a softer version of jelly beans. Now, I haven't tried Jelly Babies, but jelly beans are very good. And if I hadn't tried jelly beans, I'd be a little concerned with myself. I'm kidding, but still. Honestly, it's true. Okay. George owned cats and dogs throughout his life. He was a huge animal lover. He loved God, and he loved purple, just like me. Wow, cool. Oh, he also enjoyed the outdoors and nature. Kind of goes along with that. He enjoyed gardening, which was a big hobby of his, especially towards the end of his life. I think that's pretty cool. I like that too, nurturing the earth, if you will. Quotes. George was a very wise man with many beautiful quotes. Some of these quotes shown here are some of the ones that had the most beautiful impact. My personal favorites that really resonate with me. With our love, we could save the world. George Harrison. A lot of these are lyrics from songs. All the world is birthday cake, so take a piece, but not too much. That was on my birthday card a few years ago from my parents. So, I really like it. Silence often says much more than trying to say what's been said before. I think that's very true. You know how they called George the Quiet Beetle? I have also been told I'm very quiet, and, I think that sums it up very well. If you got something to say, it's important to say it, but I feel like sometimes people talk too much and they just talk to talk. But I kind of think deeply as well sometimes. I feel like sometimes it's just better to be quiet and think, because sometimes that's where the most words are spoken in your thoughts. Interviews. George is always called the Quiet Beetle, as I said, but George had some very interesting insight on things, which I think is very cool. As well as a very great sense of humor. It kind of reminds me of my own. Very funny guy. Here are some of my favorite interviews of George. George's impact on music. So we already kind of talked about how he had a huge impact on music, but this is diving a little deeper into it, if you will. That made me think of Yellow Submarine, a Beatles song. Okay. George had a huge impact on music that is still felt and heard in music today. If it weren't for George, who knows if Indian music would have ever been brought into Western music and culture. George brought a new sound to listeners, combining Indian culture with Western culture, thus changing music as we knew it. It's pretty dang cool. As Ken Himes, who I think that's how you say his name, he wrote an article about George. He accurately wrote, I think he summed it up pretty well in his article for Culture Sonar. I don't know how to say it, I'm probably saying it wrong, but he said George Harrison will probably always be best known as the Beatle who didn't write as much as John and Paul, but in truth, he was a major figure in 20th century popular culture whose enthusiasm, passion, and generosity had ripple effects from which we all benefit. A great artist with a big heart. George's impact on music, part 2. George also impacted musicians around him, influencing them and supporting and sharing ideas to help them as musicians and people too, I'm sure. When George recounted a time shared with Bob Dylan, he said, I was saying to him, you write incredible lyrics, and he was saying, how do you write those tunes? So I was just showing him chords like crazy, chords, because he tended just to play a lot of basic chords and move a capo up and down. I don't know what a capo is, I think it has something to do with the guitar. So, pretty cool. Tom Petty once said about George, Harrison was the kind of person that when he came across a good thing or the potential for a friend, he really was aggressive about it. And he had a way of knocking out anything that was extracurricular or in the way of what was really going on. He could get you comfortable with him very quickly. Some pictures. George's death. George Harrison, as we have discussed, was a very talented, legendary, impactful man who had a huge impact, as I said, on music in the world around us that is still felt and shared. On November 29th, 2001, which was 21 years ago today, I'm actually wearing a George shirt, by the way, it's purple, to honor him, share the love. George passed away from throat and lung cancer at just 58 years old. He left behind his friends and family, including his wife, Olivia Harrison, and his son Donnie, as well as a legacy, a catalog of hits that continue to touch hearts of listeners to this day, especially mine. As George would sing, all things must pass away. George's legacy is something that will stay. Yeah, George had just a beautiful impact, and I just feel, his last words, at least to the public, were love one another, which I think is very beautiful. It's, Jesus said that too, and I just think it's a beautiful thing, and I encourage you today and every day to share love with everyone you see, whether it's a smile, a wave, just, something simple, I guess. I think that'd be a beautiful thing. His song, Any Road, which I like to call Annie Road, is a beautiful song on his last album, and that is a link to the music video. The end. My final thoughts. So, first of all, thank you for viewing this presentation all about the legendary George Harrison. Just wanted to say thank you, George, for your music, your wisdom, and impact on humanity in general. George is an inspiration for many musicians and just, random people like me. I hope to learn to play the guitar one day. I'm learning the ukulele right now. It's a good start. And music and helping people is a huge passion of mine, and it's something I hope to carry throughout my lifetime, just like George did. So who knows, maybe someday I'll be a musician like George. No one knows what the future may hold, but what I do know is George has touched many hearts, and I'm sure he will continue for many years, generations to come. It makes me kind of emotional. To sum it up, Bob Dylan once said about George, he was a giant, a great, great soul, with all of the humanity, all of the wit and humor, in all of the wisdom, spirituality, the common sense of a man, and compassion for people. He inspired love and had the strength of 100 men. So these are the links to the resources I talked about. Thank you again, and remember, peace and love, as George would say, and remember to love one another. Peace and love. Bye.
What we came